Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk. I'm Nikki Welly from the Kellogg Hubbard Library, and we're pleased to be partnering with the League of Women Voters for this series. Before we get started, I would like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. Please remain muted throughout the presentation to ensure the best experience for all participants. If you have questions, please type them into the chat, and our moderator and speaker will address them. Now, I'm excited to pass it over to Anna, who will introduce tonight's speaker and get us started.
Hello, I'm very happy and pleased to have as our speaker Liz Santarelli, who is president of the League of Women Voters in New Hampshire, a position she has held for many years because she does it so well. She's very involved and knowledgeable about election law. She attends the hearings on election law in New Hampshire House and Senate. She and so she also testifies in those on behalf of the league. She's also an experienced presenter for the New Hampshire Humanities on women's suffrage. She's done a lot, and she is a retired educator. I am about to lose my voice, so I'm going to turn this over to Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I am going to share my screen, and we're hoping that this all works well. Are you able to see my screen in full view at this point?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry, let me go back. Let me try that once more. I think I have to press this button again and then get to the shared screen button. And are you able to see it now?
Yes, we have it perfectly.
Okay, good. Thank you. I saw some good friends from League there, Sonia and Sue Racanelli and Kate Rader. League of Women Voters, New Hampshire and Vermont did work together along with Maine and what other state? Okay, those three quad states. We had 4 states. Rhode Island would join us for annual meetings for a while and share our experiences. So I'm happy to be here sharing our experience with voter suppression. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background first to build up to this. If you know anything about some current laws in New Hampshire, you understand why I was approached by League of Women Voters Vermont, because we're having some real issues. But let's see if my screen changes and all that. Let's see if it advances. It didn't want to advance. Wait a minute. Yep, there it goes. Okay, I'm seeing the second slide that starts 2016. Are you people seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I could go back before 2016, but that's when I'm going to start, as a period when election skepticism overtook the country, primarily because of the difference between the Electoral College outcome of that vote, that presidential vote, and the popular vote. There was a mismatch. We've had those mismatches before. But in 2016, we had that. And as you know, Trump was elected that year and did not win the popular vote, but started claiming, if we counted accurately, he would have won that as well as the Electoral College. And so we started in this ballot counting frenzy. You know, are the machines wrong? Is there scamming going on? Should all votes be hand counted? And that hit New Hampshire, and there were those who said we should hand count all our ballots. So everybody did research and found out that hand counting of ballots, unless you're a very, very small town, is a lot more inaccurate than ballot counting machines. But I would say that in New Hampshire, some of our most repressive experiences started from 2016 because of this. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. But I'm going to jump first to 2020. We all remember, you know, this time 6 years ago, COVID was just kind of coming into awareness. And so we had to figure out ways to handle the 2020 election. And not only that, but handle the 2020 legislative session, which in New Hampshire goes from January to June. They scrambled beautifully at the State House to allow for online viewing of legislative hearings and also online testimony. We were testifying by Zoom. And it was used by many people who hadn't even been aware of hearings before that because they weren't able to get to Concord. And also as a result of COVID, by the November primaries, absentee voting was allowed for anyone. All you had to do was check off the box that you wanted an absentee ballot. You got one. 1/3 of New Hampshire ballots were absentee, and I suspect it may have been similar in Vermont. So that was, if there's a bright side to COVID, that was it, that it opened up the legislative experience and got people thinking differently about absentee voting. But then, of course, we come to the results of the 2020 election, where there were unsupported charges of miscounted votes, a rigged election, all of this. Investigations revealed none of those claims were true. And yet the election deniers, so it wasn't skeptics by this point, it was deniers, sought redress in that famous January 6th event 5 years ago. None of us can forget that. But what this all did was raise further questions about election integrity. Now, we had to do redistricting, didn't we? And in New Hampshire, we have 2 congressional districts. You see a map on the right, the map from 2022, when it was finally agreed upon. In New Hampshire, our redistricting is done by the legislature. That's in our Constitution. We do not have an independent redistricting commission. The governor and the legislature could not agree on the congressional map. They agreed on the Senate, the House, the other maps, but not on the congressional map. Time was running out for people to file in spring of 2022, finally. And so the state Supreme Court appointed a master to draw the congressional districts. And he used the least change philosophy. So that means that only 5 towns had to switch from District 1 to District 2, or vice versa, actually, in order to balance the population. So those 2 very differently colored districts have equal population. But that was the redistricting for Congress. I would like to point out also at that time, we had a strong Republican majority in both bodies. And so I want to show you maps on the right from 2011, and then the 22 map that was adopted for something that we call our Executive Council. If you've never heard of this, it's kind of unique to New Hampshire. It's a 5-person body that acts as a check and balance on the governor. It's part of the executive branch, 5 people. And so these maps show equal population in each of those 5 regions. And the one on the right, look at the 2011 map and look at District 2 with that yellow district. If you were to try to illustrate gerrymandering, might you use that picture? Clearly something weird is going on. We've called it a lizard, a dragon, look at the shape of that. Yes, that was gerrymandered. District 2 was the one district from the 2011 map that consistently elected a Democrat. The other districts, for the most part from 2011 on, elected Republicans. So when they drew the 2022 map on the left, look again at the yellow. It just happens they use the same colors here for District 2. Doesn't look anything like that, but it is just as gerrymandered to be Democrat. They picked up 5 college towns there, including Hanover, home of Dartmouth College and all those liberal professors. You've all heard that, right? and certain cities that tended to lean very Democrat. So again, District 2 elects a Democrat. The other 4 districts elected, and they were safe seats for Republicans. So partisan gerrymandering is certainly a form of voter suppression. We've heard of it for, what, 150 years, I guess? Here's a New Hampshire example in our executive council. We had another example of it, not as visually powerful, but the same problem in the New Hampshire Senate. We have 24 seats in our Senate. The map, the dark map on the right, is the old one. It doesn't look a lot like the 2022 map, other than the North Country is kind of shaped the same way, the most rural area. But it was even more gerrymandered for partisan advantage than the 2011 map. So the 2022 map pretty much guaranteed that there were at least 14 seats for Republicans. It turns out they got 16 out of the 24 seats, 8 seats for Dems. So as you can see, if you want to pass legislation after 2022, it's going to be pretty easy to do it if you're a Republican in the state Senate. The House is also in New Hampshire right now, Republican dominated. It's harder to gerrymander House seats because we have 400 of them, but it did lean Republican. So that kind of sets up the stage for what's going on. Now I'm going to leave legislation for a minute to talk about what happened just before our first in the nation presidential primary in January of 2024. The famous robocalls originated by that guy on the right, Steve Kramer, and a company out of Texas, phoned Democrat voters with a faked Joe Biden voice, who even used the word malarkey. Remember that Biden liked to use that word every once in a while? And Joe Biden told them, save your vote for November. Don't vote in the presidential primary. Now, President Biden had decided he was not going to run in the New Hampshire presidential primary. It was pretty clear he was going to win, but his supporters here in New Hampshire had a strong write-in campaign for him. And when this came out, it was directed to Democrat voters. The intention was to depress the turnout for the Democrats in the presidential primary. It wasn't to influence the Republican vote at all. It was because the New Hampshire had gone for Biden 4 years before, strongly. But anyway, it was to suppress voting in a different way. That is, get a phone message from your sitting president, and you are a Democrat, you are targeted in this phone call, who's going to tell you, don't worry about the primary, just save your vote for November, as though it's a chit that you've only got one of for the elections. You know, I mean, it was illogical. And so we searched and found several individuals who got the call, who were willing to become plaintiffs. The League of Women Voters was an organizational plaintiff. We sued Mr. Kramer and the robocall company. We won. The company agreed pretty quickly they would be much more careful about robocalls that they made. They would not use it for these kinds of political purposes. Mr. Kramer claimed, I just wanted to make a point. Well, he made his point. He got fined $6 million by the FCC, and then he lost the suit, and League of Women Voters gets no money for the suit, but the individual plaintiffs got, I think it was $750 each. And then in another finding, they were awarded $7,000 each for being the victims of voter interference or voter suppression. And they'll never see that money. Obviously, Mr. Kramer has neither $6 million nor those other thousands of dollars. So if somebody has a question about that case, I'd be glad to answer it now, and if not, I'll go on. So I know Anna is checking the chat thing. All right, I'm gonna go on, but just I'll answer questions at the end too if you have them. All right, so post 2020. As I said, the 2022 election brought in Republican majorities all the way around for us in the state government. So we had three important bills that went into effect in those years, were passed and went into effect. First of all, tightening of our voter ID requirements. We've had voter ID, photo ID required since 2012. But if you didn't have your photo ID with you, there was a way to get around it. You could sign an affidavit, you could have your photo taken, it was go to the Attorney General, who would verify things if there were any doubts and so on. That whole affidavit process was gone. So starting or the bill was passed in 2022, the voter ID requirements became tighter. Then the big bill that you may have heard of is the documents to prove citizenship to register. That passed in 2024. It took effect on June 1st of 2025, and I'll come back with details on that. And then the third important bill was about absentee ballot applications. We do not have no excuse absentee voting. You have to fit in one of the categories. But now the application to get your ballot requires either a copy of your ID be submitted with it or notarization of your signature. And I'll give you more information on that. So while that is happening in New Hampshire, kind of a jump ahead of other places in the country, on the federal level, the SAVE Act kind of mirrored New Hampshire's proof of citizenship new law. Now, SAVE sounds like such a good thing. Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Sounds good. It passed the US House. It has been no vote yet in the Senate. It would require all Americans to prove their citizenship status through documentation in person, not even mailed in copies, when registering to vote or when updating voter registration information. If you move from town to town, for instance. It would also get rid of online voter registration in 42 states. New Hampshire doesn't yet have that. And it would possibly disenfranchise millions who don't have those documents. So at the same time that's being tested in New Hampshire as a state law, on the federal level, this act is being pushed. It hasn't gone through the Senate yet, so don't worry. But we can talk about that later too. So let's talk about that voter registration change. As I said, it took effect January 1 last year. So we have had town elections and city municipal elections under this voter registration change. It requires documents to prove citizenship in theory for first-time New Hampshire residents only. So if you're already registered in one town, you move to another, you go to your town hall in your new town, and you should not have to prove citizenship because you will be on the statewide voter database. That's the theory. But if it's your first time registering, you just moved to New Hampshire or you're 18 and you're registering for the first time, whatever, you need to bring proof, not only an ID, we've had that for a long time, not only proof of where you live, that you live in that town, but now also you have to bring either a passport or a birth certificate or naturalization documents to prove you're a citizen. And the name on those documents must match your current ID. Let's say you're using your driver's license. Okay, wave your arm. I can't see you, but wave your arms around if your birth certificate doesn't match your current driver's license in terms of the name. Mine doesn't, right? You know, I have a married name now, you know, I had a different name then. All they can tell is, you know, that there was a baby by a certain name born a lot of years ago. So you need other documents as well to show that transition. If you're using a birth certificate from your birth name to the name you're using now. For many of us, women especially, that's a marriage license. It could be an adoption certificate. It could be some other kind of legal name change document. But you need to show these documents. So at the bottom of the screen, it says, what about people re-registering when they move to another town? Well, as I said, the law does not require them to prove citizenship, just prove who they are and where they currently live in the new town. But what we found is that election officials may ask for proof of citizenship. They should not, but we know that there are some that have. So during these municipal elections in 2025, we had poll observers in about 25% of the cities and towns, seeing who got turned away from voter registration tables. We have day of election voter registration. You can register at the polls, in other words. We saw who got turned away. We approached them. We explained who we were. We asked why they were turned away, and we asked, would they come back? There were over 200 people this year who were turned away. Many of them said they'd come back. We don't know that they did. But that means over 200 people were possibly denied the right to vote. Did they have time to go home and get documents and get back? You know, a lot of this we don't know, but we know it's an issue. It is voter suppression. There's one other problem. There's a new law also taking effect, I think it takes effect April of this year, that our voter rolls will be purged every single year. Up till now, we've been doing it every 10 years. The rolls could be cleaned if the town officials knew that somebody had died in town and could remove that person. But a full-fledged purge of people who hadn't voted for a long time, whatever, used to take place every 10 years, which was probably too infrequently. But now it's going to be every year with a 5-year look back. So if somebody has voted within the past 5 years, they can stay on the rolls, and they'll do that every year. And it requires the supervisors of the checklist in each town, there are primary election officials, to send a letter to the last recorded address informing the voter they'll be removed, and then the voter has 30 days to respond. So what happens to this citizenship requirement? Possible effects on infrequent voters. There are some people we know who vote only in the presidential elections. If they miss one, they're going to be dropped from the rolls. They may ignore that letter coming from their town, thinking it's junk mail, and they will not be on the rolls when they next go to vote. There are also voters that have been incorrectly removed. We had a league member that happened to, and can document that story. Put her house in a trust. That triggered a kind of address change, and she was removed from the voting rolls. Well, if she's not on the voting rolls and she goes to vote at 6:30, you know, a half hour before polls close, will she have her citizenship documents to get put back on the rolls? Highly unlikely. She was a league member, so the first thing she did was get on, you know, contact our local leagues and say, what do I do about this? And we resolved it. That's one person. What about the others? So there's a different kind of voter suppression, probably unintentional here, but it certainly can affect voters. So here's this other bill that I mentioned earlier about absentee voting. Now, when the argument was made that we just shouldn't have absentee voting. The only excuse in the Constitution is absence from town. Well, we know that's not realistic. There are people with disabilities who choose to vote absentee, elderly who find it too difficult to wait in lines, all of those things. Or people with unusual work hours who can't be sure that they're going to be able to get to the polls. So those things are all allowed by law, not by the Constitution. So you have to fill out an application for an absentee ballot. And now the new law says you have to do one of these things. You can go to your town clerk way ahead of time and say, here's my ID. She'll check you on the voter rolls, give you the application, mark off that you've been identified. You can fill it out and you'll get your ballot. Or you can photocopy your ID and send it with your application. That's fine if you've got a photocopier or easy access to one. Again, think of disabled people, elderly people living alone who may not have that access. Or the third choice is to have your signature on the absentee ballot application notarized. Now, if you can't get out to the polls to vote, I'm not sure how you're getting out to a notary public. There are notaries who will do home visits, if you want to call it that. They'll come to your house. They are allowed to charge anywhere from $25 and up. So we've got a dilemma here. Are you disenfranchising people with disabilities or the elderly who live alone who can't provide any of these three things? And if they can't get their absentee ballot and they feel they can't get to the polls, that is definitely voter suppression. Let's go on. There is a possible tweak in a bill this year. It has bipartisan sponsors, both from the Election Law Committee in the House, so I'm thrilled about this, that would allow absentee voters to put their driver's license number on the application. And if they've got a valid driver's license, or it's not too old anyway, the town clerks would then be able to verify their identity via Department of Motor Vehicle records. So that bill will be heard soon. And I think it may be an attempt by leadership in both parties to say, we may have gone too far with this absentee voter ID bill in the past, that we just passed. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, we had some bills held over from 2025 that would restrict what is an acceptable means of ID. When we passed voter ID in 2012, we actually had a very respectable list of ways to prove ID. It wasn't simply driver's license or passport. We had other options. But one of these bills held over from last year would prohibit using a student ID or an out-of-state driver's license. And for the elderly people who no longer drive, for many of them, their only photo ID is an out-of-state, out-of-date driver's license, which up till now would have been acceptable. So we're worried about this. And another bill would cease to allow identification by an election official. And this was not used very often, but sometimes there would be either a person with disabilities or an elderly person, usually, who simply hadn't brought an ID to the polls, but in the small towns was well known and could be marked as identified by the moderator or one of the elected officials. So the bill would disallow that practice. So it restricts the acceptable means of ID. Both of these bills have just passed in the House and will go on to the Senate and then to the governor later this year.
Liz, you have two good questions in the chat.
I would be glad to hear them. Thank you.
One is about absentee ballots for the military. Are they exempt for having to fill this out?
The military uses UOCAVA ballots, and that is a federal program, and they do not have to have the same ID on them. So yes, they would be exempt. That goes for the military and military dependents overseas, as well as American citizens living abroad.
Another question focuses on people with disabilities and older people. Can they make a claim that they're not getting accessibility for them to vote?
I think they can.
Yeah.
We have accessible voting machines for people with vision disabilities that are used at our polling places, but a disability that keeps one from leaving the house, these people are disadvantaged here. So
Wow.
we are worried that they do not have driver's licenses. Many of these same people with disabilities don't drive. They can get a non-driver's ID. They can even get it free by jumping through a little hoop at your town clerk's office, but you have to get someone to drive them to the DMV to get this non-driver's ID. And then you've got to make copies of it and send it in with the absentee ballot. So yes, there are hoops to be jumped through by people with disabilities. And they probably have a right to try to challenge these laws.
And then there's a question about what is the league doing about monitoring what the election officials are doing? Who's keeping them, honest?
Well, the election officials are not the ones we're worried about. It's the legislature that we worry about. We had, as I said, we had election observers in about a quarter of the towns and cities this past year, observing election day, watching how it went, watching what the officials did. Were they using the were they using the state voter database to verify that this was a registered voter who merely had moved? Those were the ones that I saw most often at the election day registration tables. So the League and several other of our voting rights groups in New Hampshire were working together as members of the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights to find observers, to get them to the polls. We observed at the polls just about all day long and then reported back. We had somebody on text was getting this information right away. So we discovered that the election workers were doing the best job they could to make sure that if somebody came in without an ID or without citizenship proof but needed to register, that they were able to do that if possible. Not all of them could. Some of them had to be sent home. And one woman made the news from the town of Derry, I think. She went in to register and did not have proof of citizenship. She'd recently moved to New Hampshire. So they said, well, do you have a birth certificate? She said, well, not with me, and so in a huff, she went home and got her birth certificate. I give her credit for being able to find it that quickly.
Yeah.
And she came back and they said, oh, but the name on your birth certificate doesn't match your driver's license. She said, as most women would, well, no, that's my birth name and I'm married now. They said, well, can you get your marriage license? And she said, damn it, I will. I think she really did put an expletive in there of some kind. She went home and came back a third time.
Wow.
She was interviewed by NPR and all that. I mean, so she managed to vote, but the election officials had to follow the law. And they did. And most people simply would not make 3 trips to vote in a municipal election.
Yeah. you have another question, which is in order to be, sort of a polling watcher, do you have to be a New Hampshire citizen? Can volunteers come over?
Yeah, we ended up having enough people in the Upper Valley. I think somebody asked me, do you need help there? And we did not. We had enough people up there. And I wasn't going to ask you to drive, somewhere else. But you do not need to be. We had an ID tag that the poll observer wore. I was given a seat not far from the registration table with yellow, I'll call it police tape around me. A neighbor of mine came in and said, "What happened?" I said, "I'm in timeout." No, it looked like that. So we had a number of people. They were not league members, but they were all, as far as I know, New Hampshire residents. But that wasn't a requirement. It's not like being a member. I think even if you're a member of the party and you're official party watcher, you don't have to be from in-state. So if we need help in November, I'll know who to talk to, okay? My friends in Vermont. Thank you. All right, I'm going to talk about the bottom of this screen. There was one bill that was either killed or tabled last year that would have required this kind of paper proof of where you live and your citizenship and your ID just to get a ballot, even though you already were registered. And even the legislature thought that was going too far. I guess they kind of looked at themselves and said, well, we don't carry our citizenship proof with us. Some people ask, does real ID qualify? It does not in New Hampshire. Apparently it does in some states where real ID also has a mark for citizenship on it. New Hampshire driver's licenses don't. So that was frustrating to people. And League spent a lot of time leading up to the elections in 2025 trying to explain what you needed and that real ID would not cut it. Even though most people, when they get a real ID, have to prove citizenship.
I've had questions from people who were essentially homeless, who would like to vote. Some of them do have ID, but they don't. You say, where do they live? Well, let's see, sometimes they're living outside and sometimes they're living in the church. So I think that those people are kind of out of luck.
Well, in New Hampshire, they are allowed to register in the town where they get their government documents, even if it's a shelter or a social service agency. So they can get a document that says, not so much that they live there, but rather this is their domicile for voting purposes. What they often don't have, though, is proof of citizenship. Someone who is homeless often has no birth certificate that they can locate anymore. So that first time registration is the difficulty for them. And the ID as well. I mean, some people live in their cars and they've actually got a driver's license. That's an ID. But we know there are many people who are challenged, and all of these things just make it harder, as well as harder for the average citizen who just doesn't have these documents at hand. I'm going to go on to one more attempt at voter suppression. New Hampshire has about 40% of our voters as undeclared. If you want to think of that as independent voters, feel free to. Our two parties, our Democrats and Republicans, in terms of voter registration, are about equal. But 40% of New Hampshire voters are undeclared. So that's the biggest party, basically. And we have traditionally been able to vote in our presidential primary or in the state primary by simply asking for a ballot of whichever party we prefer. And then before we leave the polling place, we can switch back to undeclared. And so again, in this spirit of let's deny voting if we can, there were two bills that were going to require voters to declare a party affiliation way ahead of the filing date, even before we knew who was running. And that's just not the way we've operated. I think it went so much against our tradition in the state that the bills were killed in the House. But it was one more attempt to deny participation, in this case, in the primary, to a voter that's not as easily controlled as those in your own party. Isn't this fun? I'm just, okay. So where do we go from here? Well, we've heard lots of things. We expect to hear them again. And some of these make sense. Voting should be easy to do, hard to cheat. Yes. But what does that mean? You know, how hard do you make it to cheat? Only citizens shall vote. Well, duh, that's in the Constitution, federal and state. And then the doubting about ballot counting machines. They can be hacked. I want my ballot hand counted. All ballots should be hand counted. And now I live in a city. I would not want the city of Manchester to hand count ballots. It would take days. The people who claim voting must be done in person with only a very few exceptions, such as the military. And the bill I said was defeated, but we'll still hear it, must prove ID, residence, and citizenship every time they vote. And voting fraud has gone undetected too long. We do investigate suspected voting fraud for the most part in New Hampshire. It probably happens in Vermont as well. Voting fraud is committed by people who own homes in two communities and feel that entitles them to vote in each community. We know that's not true. You have a hard time convincing some of them. And that's primarily the cases of voting fraud that we discover. And then ballots and voting rolls should be publicly available for inspection. Well, some parts of the voting rolls are, but the ballots, no, I don't want anybody actually touching our paper ballots. And yet that was one of the things that was argued. It's not a bill yet, but it's been argued. So we're moving into 2026, and next week is the first election law hearing on bills. There are some good ones and there's some bad ones. And at this point, I'm not going to predict which ones are going to pass. There's a bill to create an independent redistricting commission. It will be advisory only because our Constitution says the state legislature has to do the redistricting, but we would like an independent commission to be there developing the maps. There is a bill, just as there was in Texas and California and a handful of other states, to redistrict the congressional districts. Normally, that would not be legal mid-decade in New Hampshire. It is because if you remember the earlier part when I was talking about gerrymandering, the legislature did not draw those congressional maps. They were vetoed by the governor. The court-appointed special master drew them. And so it probably would be legal to redraw those congressional districts. The bill's sponsors were doing so at the bidding of the federal executive. Because both seats are currently held by Dems, they think they can gerrymander it to get one Republican vote in there in CD1. I told you there's a bill to add the driver's license to the absentee ballot application. That's a good bill. I'm going to support that. And what do you think of the next one? House Bill 1062, directing the Secretary of State to conduct random citizenship audits of already registered voters. It's not clear how the Secretary of State would do that? It's not clear how much information would be made public. I'm hoping this one goes away. We do not allow voter registration at the DMV. Some states do. Many states do. There is a bill that would allow that for the very first time in New Hampshire. If you're going to register your car or renew your license, you could also register to vote. Excuse me a second. And I've held the worst for last. So this is not passed, all right? These are all bills coming up. Here we go. House Bill 1520 requires not only US citizenship and New Hampshire residency to vote, but also New Hampshire citizenship. Okay, Vermont listeners, are you citizens of Vermont or are you citizens of the US? Do you recite a Pledge of Allegiance to Vermont? This bill would require creating a Pledge of Allegiance to New Hampshire as one way of proving your New Hampshire citizenship, and it would require the Secretary of State to develop a citizenship card to issue to citizens of New Hampshire, who presumably have to prove that by pledging allegiance. I'm trying to joke about this because as I was thinking about this afternoon on my walk, I was thinking about my testimony on this bill. And I'm quite serious that I'm going to say, I am the president of the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. But if this bill passes, requiring me to pledge allegiance to New Hampshire, I will stop voting rather than do that. I do not have allegiance to a state. So I just throw that out there and let you think about that. I can't believe this is happening, but there it is a bill. So as you see, voter suppression in New Hampshire, at least, takes many forms. It needs many people to fight it. We are fighting I didn't say it when I was talking about 1569. We are fighting the citizenship requirement. We go to court on February 9th, along with the ACLU and several other groups. But the fight is continuous. Our votes are our voices. We have to use them. We need fair maps. We need to be able to vote. And at that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and hope you're still all there. Oh, thank you. You're there.
You have quite a few more questions.
I'd be glad to hear them. I can't see them right now. So if
Okay.
you want to pick some
I'll
out
read
for
them
me.
to you. A long one. Can you comment on what is being proposed in various states like New Hampshire, how that compares to how other countries like England or Australia handle absentee voting, voter ID? It would be interesting to know if they have these kind of challenges as well.
I don't know about other countries. You know, we've done research on other states. And New Hampshire's absentee voting laws are among the strictest, and our voting registration law for first-time residents, registrants, is definitely the strictest in the country. So I can't compare it to other states, but I'm kind of ashamed that we are ranking #1 in those things here in New Hampshire.
Another question is, did the New Hampshire Secretary of State turn over the voter rolls when asked by the president?
He did not. He is still sitting on them. He said
Good.
state law forbids that. 4 voters have filed suit against the federal government for requesting that. Oh, because the federal government, sorry, I should say it this way. Federal government is suing the Secretary of State for not turning over those rolls. And these four voters of different parties and different persuasions. It's a fascinating group of four, got permission to file as kind of co-defendants along with the Secretary of State. And the League of Women Voters, New Hampshire, is about to file an amicus brief on that same case. I don't know when that will be heard, but no, those voter rolls have not been turned over yet.
Another question, does a passport count as proof of citizenship and proof of where you live?
This passport does not have your address on it. So it doesn't prove where you live, but it is perfect proof of citizenship. Sometimes you handwrite, you put your address in your passport, so if it's lost, you get it back, but it's not part of the passport.
And a really interesting question is, Vermont has the Freeman's Oath. And Eve, you're going to have to tell us more about it, which is a pledge to uphold the interests of Vermont when voting and to serve what? The public good.
Wow. Well, maybe that's the one New Hampshire is going to have to adopt and just change the state. Eve, is that something that people normally do use? Oh,
I've never seen it, but Nikki said she actually did.
I'm seeing if we
so
can.
So when you register to vote, you do have to take that oath. You have to sign it. But it's phrased in terms of upholding the public good and voting without fear of favor or something like that. It's very good government framing, but it also includes some language about pledging to support the best interests of Vermont. And I'm not quite sure that that's the same thing that they're proposing in New Hampshire, but you could perhaps frame it that way if it looks like it's going that way. And you could say, well, why don't we broaden it to talk about these good things that the voter would then be affirming. And Nikki, I know, is a relatively new Vermont resident, and she says she recently, oh no, somebody says that somebody else wrote in that it's not required.
Oh.
Well, it definitely was when I moved here. Okay. Anna, it must have been when you moved here. So now I'm
probably,
not sure
yeah.
Well, that's fascinating.
I
mean, this bill does not have any language for a Pledge of Allegiance. It just says you have to take a Pledge of Allegiance. And frankly, a Pledge of Allegiance is a very serious thing. And I don't mind saying it for the US, and I believe it. I say it with heart, but I would not say that about a state. I think Kate Rader wanted to comment on that. Do you know more about that Freeman's Oath, Kate? Oh, there are lots of people who said they took it way back when. It just may not be required anymore, huh? I think Kate's trying to speak and she can't unmute.
I'm Sonia Schuyler and I register voters every month. And
Yeah.
it is still required on the first registration. If you move, you only need to take it once. So if you re-register or if you leave the state and come back and you took the Freeman's Oath when you first registered, you don't have to take it in, but it is still required.
There is one change, though. It does not have to be administered by a notary.
Right.
You can assert it yourself and sign it yourself.
Okay, I'm going to get a copy of this before I testify and make a fool of myself in the New Hampshire legislature. I'm still saying I won't pledge allegiance to New Hampshire, but okay. This is fascinating. Thank you very much. I will try to get a copy of that somehow. Thank you. What else do we have, Anna, as a question? Anna, you're muted.
That won't help. Simply, I think you already covered them. What is the league doing about monitoring what election officials are doing? I had a question. There were a number of false information cases in which actually the Koch brothers put out, would send incorrect information to Democratic voters, telling them that, oh my gosh, you have to vote by, so and so, and which was not true, or you have to do it this or that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't discovered right away. Have we seen anything like that?
The closest was that Biden robocall.
Oh, yes.
Otherwise, we have not seen that kind of influence in New Hampshire. There was something, and it's probably going back about 8 years ago, when the party sent out some misleading information about voter registration or absentee ballots. I'm not, I don't remember that, but they were roundly chastised. I don't know that they were fined. It was misleading rather than false, as I recall. But I think we all as voters have to be very aware of that. If you hear something and it doesn't sound right, it may not be right. And we have an obligation to figure it out. And the league tries to track those things down too. So we'd love to hear about this in whichever state you're living in. Yeah. Do we
Other
have anything
questions?
else? I think I depressed everybody here. I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah.
it's incredibly important. And if you look at the history of how people have been purged from roles, before they never could get on the literacy tests. But 1998, Florida purged over 1,000 voters wrongly.
Yeah.
Georgia
Kansas
did
did
it
something
later.
similar. Yeah. And so we are aware of that. I think we're more aware of it than we were. And we know if you're purged, you can make a fuss, you can try to get back on. But the fact that we have same-day voter registration means that somebody might wait too long and then not be able to prove citizenship or prove domicile even because they think they're already registered. So I think we're going to have some problems with that this year, especially because it's going to be a big midterm election. We're going to have a huge turnout in November. And there's not going to be time at the polls to deal with some of these issues. During our municipal elections, when we were observing, there were some situations that took 15 or 20 minutes to resolve, but there wasn't a huge line of people waiting behind them. So the ballot clerks or the registrars, whoever was doing it, were able to deal with that. The best one I overheard was a young couple came in, a couple in their 20s. He had just moved into her apartment. I think they were married, but I didn't care. But anyway, he just moved in there, so he was registering as a new registrant in the city and in the state. He had moved from another state to join his lady. And he did not have his citizenship documents with him. She was registered. So she turned to him and said, well, where's your passport? And he said, well, it's in the drawer at home. And she, being the quick-witted one in this family, said, let's call the dog sitter and see if she can find it. And she can text you a picture of it. And darn it, if that's not what they did. And I overheard her call the dog sitter, who said, well, I'm next door right now. Yeah, I'll go over. And where is it? Which drawer? And she found it and she texted a picture and he was able to register. So I give
Great.
credit to the election officials who patiently waited to hear from the dog sitter and this quick-witted woman who was darn certain to get her man to register. So there
Along
we go.
those lines, you also have a question about how much do these changes cost, the town clerk offices? Do they have the staff to do all this?
The problem is that access to that statewide database is limited. In most towns, there's one person who has access to it. In the cities, there are 3. Some cities have 9 polling places. So you could try to register at the polls in a place where they don't have access to that database. And then everything's got to go through the phone lines to the person who has access at City Hall or something. That is labor intensive, it's cost prohibitive in some ways. And it's making lines, it's taking time for everyone at the polls. So we are worried about that very much, and that's one of our charges with this citizenship law, that it will disenfranchise people just because the clerks, the ballot workers can't deal with this, you know, on election day. Well, I don't know if you have more questions, Anna. You kind of disappeared on me there.
Oh, I'm still here, but I think that those are the questions that you have gotten and you answered them very well. So
Well,
does anybody else have a last minute question?
Actually, I do, Anna. Can I talk out loud here?
Sure.
yeah.
Are there efforts to educate voters about about what faces them? A concerted effort by the league and other people to actually get this information out to voters, especially, you know, disengaged voters that haven't voted for a while?
Well, the disengaged voters are, of course, the hard ones to reach. So we have done tabling events at farmers markets and town festivals. We have had a very active presence in 2025 on Facebook, trying to get the word out, asking people to share it. The Secretary of State has had some excellent posts on Facebook, which I then shared and paid to boost statewide to try to get word out. There have been articles in the newspapers, some more accurate than others, about what the law requires. That's always a problem, you know. There was one article that left the impression that in order to fill out an absentee ballot, you needed to do all three things: show an ID, send a copy of an ID, and get notarized. And it's really one of those three, you know. In terms of that bill that we're making fun of, the Pledge Allegiance to New Hampshire bill, the fiscal committee note on it is that it would cost the Secretary of State at least $2.5 million to do appropriate education statewide for people to know that they had to do this. So it can be prohibitively expensive for the state to make these changes and publicize them so that they do not disenfranchise people. The league does its best, and we have several voting rights partner organizations that do the same thing: social media, tabling, emails to membership, and so on. It's hard. You do not reach the disengaged voters, the infrequent voters, as we sometimes call them.
Nikki has two questions, one of which is, do you think there's a national conscientious effort to suppress voter activity in November by deploying the National Guard to various cities?
Whoa, I hadn't made that connection. Now you've given me something else to worry about.
Yeah.
And I guess we all should. Okay.
She also asks, is it true that the League of Women Voters cannot stand outside of institutions to register new Americans who had just become natural citizens?
That's true.
It is.
That's a new federal law this year. That they used to be able to set up a table at a naturalization ceremony in some states if state law allowed it. New Hampshire never allows third-party registrations, so it didn't change anything for us. But for the majority of states that allow a third party to register someone and then submit the paperwork, you can no longer do it at a naturalization ceremony. Federal law. Have I exhausted you all?
There are many glowing reports, and the League in Vermont is spending a lot of time trying to educate voters about changes that may affect voting. For example, USPS change in where mail is postmarked and how that may affect voting. In addition, many state leagues sponsor Vote for 11, a one-stop site for all your voting and election information, and much, much more.
Yeah, if you live in a state that has a postmark deadline for an absentee ballot, then the new postal regulations affect you. If you live in a state that has a deadline for when the ballot is received, as New Hampshire does, 5 p.m. at the town clerk's office, basically, on election day, then the postmark doesn't matter, but we all know the postal service has slowed down a bit in recent years. Am I saying that as politely as I can? So anybody voting absentee needs to take that into account. And you have to figure out which state you're in, the postmark state or the actual date on which the ballot must be there at the town clerk or whatever, the office. Yeah.
So we've got lots of thank yous. Many people saying this was excellent. Excellent program with real examples. Thank you for sharing the New Hampshire experience, the warning for us. And so thank you.
All right. Well,
very much.
It's been my pleasure. I thank you for your attention tonight. And, I think we are a warning to other states. We are seeing real problems in New Hampshire. We're bringing lawsuits. We hope we will win some of them at least. But it means everybody has to be vigilant because these things can change fairly quickly, as you saw with my list of New Hampshire changes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay.
Goodbye, everybody.